When desperation forces you to risk everything you have left, sometimes the most reckless act of kindness becomes the moment that changes not just your life, but the lives of everyone around you. Dirksubben de Kurpurdur Kurfor de Figure de Kur de Kurfor de Kurpurdur Tuwenderi Stordus. Marcus Whitfield was 3 weeks away from losing his family's century-old farm when he made a decision that would either save everything or destroy what little remained. His neighbors called him foolish, his bank called him irresponsible. But the voice on the radio that night called him a hero, and that single choice would lead to discoveries that no one in Millbrook Valley could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the drought-stricken fields of Whitfield Farm, illuminating row after row of withered corn that should have been shoulder-high by August, but barely reached Marcus's knees. The sight of his failing crops had become a daily reminder of how quickly a man's world could collapse, even when that world had been built by 4 generations of careful hands and stubborn determination. Marcus stood on the wraparound porch of the farmhouse his great-grandfather had built in 1923, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he stared at the foreclosure notice that had arrived with yesterday's mail. $96,000. That was what stood between his family and homelessness, between continuing a legacy that stretched back to the 1920s, and watching strangers auction off everything his ancestors had died to protect. The irony wasn't lost on him that the helicopter sitting in his barn was worth nearly twice that amount. The Bell 206 had been his father's pride and joy, purchased during the prosperous years when Whitfield Farm had contracts with 3 major food distributors and cash flow that seemed as reliable as sunrise. Robert Whitfield had learned to fly during his tour in Vietnam, and when he returned to Indiana, he'd saved every penny for 15 years to buy that helicopter, claiming it would revolutionize their farming operation. For a while it had. The Bell 206 allowed them to survey hundreds of acres in minutes, spot irrigation problems before they became disasters, and apply precise treatments to specific sections of crops. During harvest season, Marcus could coordinate with ground crews from the air, directing combines and trucks with an efficiency that had made other farmers in the valley envious. But that was before the drought, before the trade disputes that had eliminated their international contracts, before the equipment failures that had drained their emergency fund, and before the medical bills that had consumed their savings during his father's final battle with cancer. Now the helicopter sat unused in the barn, too expensive to operate, and too valuable to keep, yet too meaningful to sell. Every time Marcus considered putting it on the market, he remembered his father's hands on the controls, the pride in Robert's voice when he explained how the aircraft would secure their family's future for generations. Selling it would feel like admitting that his father's vision had been wrong, that the farm was truly finished. His wife Sarah emerged from the kitchen, carrying their 18-month-old daughter Emma on her hip and wearing the kind of forced smile that had become her default expression since the financial crisis had begun. Sarah had married a successful farmer with prospects and security, but she'd never complained as those prospects had evaporated and that security had crumbled. Instead, she'd taken a job at the local grocery store, working evening shifts while Marcus handled the farm during the day, leaving them like ships passing in the night, as they both worked desperately to save what they could. "Coffee's getting cold," she said, settling Emma into her high chair and beginning the morning routine that provided structure to days that otherwise felt chaotic and uncertain. "Did you call the bank about the extension?" Marcus folded the foreclosure notice and slipped it into his shirt pocket, unwilling to let Emma see the fear in his eyes, even though she was too young to understand. "Meeting with them this afternoon. Johnson says there might be options if we can show them a realistic payment plan." The realistic payment plan existed only in theory. Marcus had spent hours with spreadsheets and calculators, trying to find a combination of cost cuts and income increases that would satisfy the bank's requirements. Every scenario required either selling the helicopter or finding an additional source of income that didn't currently exist. The corn crop that should have provided their primary revenue was a total loss, the soybeans were marginal at best, and the small herd of cattle they'd maintained as insurance against crop failures wouldn't bring enough money to make a significant difference. Sarah poured herself coffee and sat across from him at the kitchen table their great-grandmother had built from oak harvested on the farm. The table had witnessed 4 generations of Whitfield family meals, celebrations and crisis discussions, and Marcus wondered if this would be the last year it would sit in this kitchen. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice careful in the way that meant she'd been rehearsing the conversation. My sister called last night. She and David are looking for a farm manager for their operation in Oregon. It would be good money, benefits, housing provided. The offer was generous and practical, exactly the kind of opportunity that any reasonable person would consider seriously. David's agricultural consulting business had grown into a multi-million-dollar operation, and they needed someone with Marcus's experience to oversee their demonstration farms and research facilities. It would mean financial security, a fresh start, and freedom from the daily stress of wondering whether they'd have a home next month. It would also mean the end of Whitfield Farm and everything it represented. Marcus looked around the kitchen where he'd eaten breakfast every morning for 34 years, where his grandmother had taught him to recognize the sound of different birds and predict weather patterns, where his father had explained the mysteries of soil composition and crop rotation that had been passed down through generations of farmers who'd learned their craft through trial and error and careful observation. "It's a good offer," Marcus said finally, because he knew it was what Sarah needed to hear, even though the words felt like admitting defeat. Emma banged her spoon against her high-chair tray, demanding attention and breakfast with the kind of straightforward honesty that adults had learned to complicate with doubts and fears. Sarah began preparing oatmeal, while Marcus tried to imagine explaining to his daughter someday why he'd been the Whitfield who'd given up, why he'd been the one who'd let the farm slip away when 4 generations before him had found ways to survive droughts, depressions, wars, and every other challenge the world had thrown at rural America. The radio on the kitchen counter was tuned to the local emergency services frequency, a habit Marcus had developed during his volunteer work with the county search and rescue team. His pilot training in helicopter had made him valuable for locating lost hikers, surveying flood damage, and providing aerial support for emergency responders, though he hadn't been able to afford the fuel for volunteer flights in recent months. The radio crackled with routine morning chatter between dispatchers and patrol units until an urgent tone broke through the normal communications. "All units, we have a priority medical emergency at mile marker 47 on County Road 15. Single vehicle accident with 1 victim trapped and critically injured. Requesting immediate helicopter transport to Regional Medical Center. Response time is critical." Marcus knew County Road 15 well, a winding stretch of asphalt that cut through the hills west of Millbrook Valley. It was the kind of road that demanded careful driving under the best conditions, and recent rain had made the curves treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with the area. Mile marker 47 was particularly dangerous, a sharp bend that overlooked a 40-foot drop into a rocky creek bed. "Unit 7 responding," came the voice of Sheriff Deputy Kate Morrison, "but I'm 20 minutes out. Ambulance is dispatched but they'll need 45 minutes to reach the scene, and another 30 to transport to the hospital. We're looking at over an hour before the victim receives trauma care." The county's emergency helicopter was undergoing maintenance and wouldn't be available for at least 6 hours. The closest medical helicopter was stationed 90 miles away and would require nearly an hour to reach the scene. For someone with critical injuries, particularly internal bleeding or traumatic brain injury, an hour could be the difference between recovery and permanent disability, between survival and death. Marcus found himself standing without conscious decision, his body responding to years of emergency response training before his mind had fully processed what he was considering. Sarah looked up from Emma's breakfast preparation, recognizing the expression that meant her husband was about to make a decision that would change everything. "Marcus, no," she said, understanding immediately what he was thinking. "We can't afford the fuel, we can't afford the insurance liability, and we definitely can't afford to risk the helicopter when it's the only valuable asset we have left." Every rational argument supported Sarah's position. The helicopter represented their only chance. The Fagus Pirosinid their only chance of paying off enough debt to negotiate with the bank. Flying an emergency rescue mission would cost several $100s in fuel and expose them to liability risks that could destroy them financially even if everything went perfectly. If something went wrong during the rescue, if the helicopter was damaged or if someone was injured, the lawsuits and repair costs would guarantee their bankruptcy. But the voice on the radio belonged to someone who was dying while emergency responders struggled with distance and time constraints that Marcus could eliminate with a 15-minute flight. The same aircraft that represented their financial salvation could save a life today, right now, in a way that would matter more than money or property, or any of the things that seemed so important when measured against mortgage payments and bank meetings. "Unit 7, this is Marcus Whitfield," he said into his radio handset. his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. "I have a Bell 206 helicopter available for immediate emergency transport. I can be airborne in 5 minutes and at your location in 12. The radio was silent for a moment that stretched long enough for Marcus to question his sanity. Then Deputy Morrison's voice came back, tight with relief and urgency. "Marcus, are you certain? We're talking about a trauma situation with significant medical needs during transport." Marcus had flown enough emergency missions to understand the implications. This wouldn't be a simple transport of a stable patient. Someone with critical injuries would require careful handling, precise flying, and the kind of split-second decision-making that could mean the difference between delivering a living patient or a corpse. The responsibility was enormous, and the risks extended far beyond financial concerns. "I'm certain," Marcus replied, already moving toward the door and the barn where the helicopter waited. "I'll need someone to clear a landing zone at the scene and coordinate with regional medical for their helicopter pad." Sarah caught his arm as he reached for his flight jacket, her eyes bright with tears that mixed fear and pride in proportions that neither of them could calculate. She understood better than anyone what this decision meant for their family's future, but she also understood the man she'd married and the values that had shaped 4 generations of Whitfields, who'd chosen to help their neighbors regardless of the personal cost. "Be careful," she said, kissing him quickly. "Come home safely." The barn that housed the helicopter had been built specifically for the aircraft, with reinforced concrete floors and electrical systems that could handle the specialized equipment required for maintenance and pre-flight preparations. Marcus had spent countless hours in this space, first learning from his father, and later maintaining the aircraft himself to reduce operating costs. Every gauge, every switch, every safety protocol was as familiar to him as the layout of his own house. The pre-flight inspection that normally took 15 minutes was compressed into 5, Marcus's hands moving with practiced efficiency, while his mind ran through emergency medical transport procedures he'd learned during his search and rescue training. The helicopter's medical equipment was basic but functional, including oxygen tanks, a basic life support kit, and restraint systems designed to secure patients during transport. The Bell 206 started with the familiar whine of turbine engines spooling up, a sound that had once represented hope and prosperity, but now felt like a desperate gamble with everything they had left. As the rotor blades began their rotation, Marcus performed the final systems checks that would determine whether the aircraft was safe for flight. Everything was green. Engines running smoothly, hydraulics normal, navigation systems operational. The helicopter that had sat unused for months because they couldn't afford to operate it, was performing flawlessly when someone's life depended on its reliability. Marcus lifted off from the farm's helicopter pad, and turned west toward County Road 15, climbing to 800 feet and pushing the aircraft to its maximum cruise speed. Below him, the Indiana countryside scrolled past in a patchwork of farms and forests that looked deceptively peaceful from the air. Most of the farms showed signs of the same drought stress that had devastated his own crops, but the perspective of flight somehow made individual problems seem smaller and more manageable. The flight to mile marker 47 took 11 minutes, and Marcus could see the emergency vehicles gathered around a single car that had left the road and rolled down the embankment into the creek bed. The vehicle was a sedan that had struck a tree during its descent, and the driver's side was compressed in a way that suggested serious injuries for anyone who had been behind the wheel. Deputy Morrison had done an excellent job of clearing a landing zone in a field adjacent to the accident scene, and Marcus set the helicopter down on level ground about 50 yards from where paramedics were working to extract the victim from the wreckage. The rotor wash stirred up dust and debris, but the landing was smooth and the helicopter was positioned for rapid departure once the patient was loaded.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
As Marcus shut down the engines and prepared to assist with the patient transfer, he got his first look at the accident victim and felt his stomach clench with recognition of how serious the situation had become. The person being extracted from the wreckage was a woman in her 30s, unconscious and bleeding from multiple injuries that included obvious head trauma and probable internal injuries from the impact. The paramedics worked with professional efficiency, stabilizing her neck and spine while extricating her from the twisted metal of the car's interior. Their radio chatter was filled with medical terminology that Marcus didn't fully understand, but the urgency in their voices made it clear that time was running out for their patient. "We need to get her airborne immediately," the lead paramedic called to Marcus as they prepared the stretcher for transport. "She's got signs of internal bleeding and possible traumatic brain injury. Every minute we delay reduces her chances of survival." Loading the patient into the helicopter required careful coordination between the medical team and Marcus's knowledge of the aircraft's systems. The stretcher had to be secured in a way that provided access for medical care during flight while ensuring that nothing would shift during takeoff, flight, or landing. The patient's condition was deteriorating even as they worked, her vital signs dropping in ways that made everyone involved move faster despite the need for careful handling. The flight to Regional Medical Center normally took 22 minutes, but Marcus pushed the helicopter to its limits, flying at maximum speed while maintaining the smooth, stable flight characteristics that critical patients required. The paramedic who had accompanied them worked continuously during the flight, monitoring vital signs and administering medications that Marcus couldn't identify but that seemed to be keeping their patient alive. "She's stabilizing," the paramedic reported as they approached the hospital. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. This is the smoothest emergency transport I've ever experienced." The landing at Regional Medical Center was textbook perfect, with Marcus setting the helicopter down on the hospital's designated helicopter pad while the trauma team waited to receive their patient. The transfer from aircraft to hospital took less than 3 minutes, and Marcus watched the medical team rush their patient into the emergency department with the kind of coordinated urgency that suggested she had a real chance of survival. The return flight to Whitfield Farm was quiet and contemplative, giving Marcus time to process what he had just risked and accomplished. The helicopter had performed flawlessly, the patient had been delivered alive to the medical care she needed, and no one had been injured during the rescue operation. By any measure, the mission had been a complete success. But the success had come at a cost that Marcus was only beginning to calculate. The fuel for the round trip would cost nearly $400, money that had been earmarked for groceries and utility bills. The wear and tear on the helicopter, while minimal, represented additional maintenance costs that would eventually require attention. Most significantly, the aircraft had been exposed to liability risks that could have destroyed his family financially if anything had gone wrong. As he landed back at the farm and shut down the engines, Marcus found Sarah waiting beside the helicopter pad with an expression that mixed relief with anxiety. She had spent the entire time he was gone calculating the same costs and risks that were now occupying his thoughts, but she had also spent that time knowing that her husband was risking everything they had left to save a stranger's life. "How did it go?" she asked as he climbed down from the pilot's seat. "She was alive when we delivered her to the hospital," Marcus replied, which was the only measure of success that really mattered. "The paramedic said she had a good chance of recovery if she got proper trauma care quickly enough." Sarah nodded, understanding that her husband had done exactly what his grandfather and great-grandfather would have done in the same situation. The Whitfield family had always been the kind of people who helped their neighbors during emergencies, regardless of the personal cost. It was one of the values that had shaped 4 generations of farmers who had built their lives around community and mutual support. But values didn't pay mortgage payments and kindness didn't eliminate debt. As they walked back to the house together, both of them understood that the decision to fly the rescue mission had probably sealed the fate of Whitfield Farm. The money spent on fuel represented resources they couldn't afford to lose, and the risk they had assumed could have consequences that extended far beyond their current financial crisis. That evening, after Emma had been put to bed and the daily farm chores had been completed, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with the foreclosure notice and a calculator, trying to find a mathematical solution to problems that had moved beyond the reach of simple arithmetic. The rescue mission had been the right thing to do, but it had also been the final gesture of a man who was running out of options. Sarah sat across from him, ostensibly reading a magazine but actually watching her husband struggle with decisions that no farmer should have to make. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock that had belonged to Marcus's grandmother and the distant sound of wind moving through the corn that would never reach harvest. "I called my sister back," Sarah said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the past hour. "The job offer in Oregon is still available. David says they need someone to start as soon as possible." Marcus looked up from the foreclosure notice, seeing in his wife's eyes the same mixture of sadness and practicality that had characterized their conversations about the farm's future. Sarah had grown up in town, not on a farm, and while she had embraced rural life and supported his commitment to continuing his family's legacy, she was also realistic about their situation in ways that sometimes escaped him. "It would solve our immediate problems," Marcus admitted, because he knew it was true. The salary David was offering would provide financial security and allow them to start over without the burden of debt and failing crops that had made every day a struggle for survival. But it wouldn't solve the problem of what happens to this place, Sarah replied, gesturing around the kitchen that had been the heart of family life for nearly a century. Your great-grandfather built this house with his own hands. Your grandfather survived the Depression here. Your father fought to modernize the operation and make it profitable. Are you really ready to be the one who walks away? The question struck at the heart of Marcus's internal conflict. Saving the farm had become more than a financial challenge. It had become a test of whether he was worthy of the legacy his ancestors had created, whether he possessed the courage and determination that had allowed previous generations to overcome obstacles that had seemed insurmountable at the time. His great-grandfather had started with 40 acres and a team of horses, building the operation one field at a time during the economic uncertainty that followed World War I. His grandfather had held on to the farm during the Great Depression by growing vegetables for local families and raising chickens for eggs when cash crops failed to provide adequate income. His father had modernized the operation during the 1970s and 1980s, investing in new equipment and expanding the acreage until Whitfield Farm was one of the most successful operations in the county. Each generation had faced challenges that seemed to threaten the farm's survival, and each generation had found ways to adapt and overcome. But Marcus was confronting a combination of circumstances that felt different from anything his ancestors had experienced. The drought was the worst in recorded history for their region. The international trade disputes had eliminated markets that had been reliable for decades. The consolidation of agriculture into massive corporate operations had made it nearly impossible for family farms to compete on price and efficiency. Most challenging of all, the economic pressures had eliminated the margin for error that had allowed previous generations to take risks and experiment with new approaches. Marcus couldn't afford to try new crops or invest in different equipment because every decision carried the potential for catastrophic failure. The helicopter rescue mission had been a perfect example of the impossible choices he faced. Doing the right thing had required risking everything he was trying to protect. The telephone rang at 9:47 p.m., interrupting their quiet conversation with the kind of unexpected urgency that always seemed to bring bad news. Marcus answered reluctantly, expecting to hear from the bank or perhaps from one of his neighbors reporting problems with livestock or equipment. Instead, he heard an unfamiliar voice that spoke with the crisp precision of someone accustomed to being listened to and obeyed. Mr. Whitfield, this is Dr. Elizabeth Harrison at Regional Medical Center. I understand you were the pilot who transported our patient from the accident scene this afternoon. Marcus confirmed his identity while wondering why the hospital would be calling him directly. Emergency transport was usually coordinated through official channels, and pilots typically had no direct contact with medical staff unless there were problems or complications that required follow-up investigation. Whitfield, I wanted to call you personally to thank you for your quick response today. The patient you transported is going to make a full recovery, and I can say with certainty that she would not have survived if you hadn't been willing to provide emergency transport. Your flying probably saved her life. The relief Marcus felt was overwhelming and unexpected. He had participated in search and rescue operations before, but this was the first time he had transported someone whose injuries were life-threatening, and the uncertainty about the outcome had been weighing on him since the moment he'd delivered the patient to the hospital. I'm glad she's going to be okay, Marcus replied. Is there anything else I need to know about the transport? Any paperwork or follow-up requirements? Dr. Harrison's voice carried a note of amusement that suggested she was smiling as she spoke. Actually, Mr. Whitfield, there is something else. The patient you rescued is Dr. Catherine Morgan, and she's been asking to speak with you. Would it be possible for you to visit her sometime in the next few days? The request was unusual but not unreasonable. Patients sometimes wanted to thank the people who had helped during their emergencies, and Marcus had no objection to visiting someone whose life he had helped save. After confirming that he would stop by the hospital the following afternoon, he hung up the phone and relayed the conversation to Dr. Catherine Morgan, Sarah repeated thoughtfully. That name sounds familiar. Where have I heard it before? Marcus couldn't place the name either, but he was more interested in the relief of knowing that the rescue mission had been successful than in speculating about the patient's identity. The helicopter flight had accomplished exactly what it was supposed to accomplish. Morgan was going to recover completely from injuries that could have been fatal without immediate medical attention. The following afternoon, Marcus drove to Regional Medical Center wearing his best shirt and carrying a small bouquet of flowers that Sarah had suggested might be appropriate for visiting a recovering patient. The hospital was a sprawling complex that served a region covering hundreds of square miles, and Marcus had to ask for directions twice before finding the trauma care unit where Dr. Morgan was recovering. The woman he found in room 312 looked dramatically different from the unconscious, bleeding patient he had transported the previous day. Catherine Morgan was sitting up in bed wearing a hospital gown but alert and articulate despite the bandages that covered a significant portion of her head and the various monitors that tracked her vital signs. She was probably in her early 40s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that studied Marcus with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was accustomed to making rapid assessments of people and situations. Despite her injuries and the institutional setting, she projected an aura of competence and authority that made it clear she was someone who was used to being in charge of important matters. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, extending her hand with a grip that was firm despite her recent trauma. "Please call me Catherine. I can't thank you enough for what you did yesterday. Dr. Harrison tells me that your quick response probably saved my life." Marcus accepted her thanks with the kind of uncomfortable modesty that characterized farmers who were more comfortable discussing crop yields than personal heroics. "I'm just glad you're going to be okay. Anyone with a helicopter would have done the same thing." Catherine's smile suggested that she disagreed with his assessment of the situation. "Actually, Mr. Whitfield, most people with helicopters would have considered the liability risks and insurance complications before making such a decision. What you did required real courage and a willingness to put someone else's needs ahead of your own interests." The conversation that followed revealed that Catherine Morgan was not simply a patient recovering from a car accident, but someone whose presence in Indiana was connected to business interests that extended far beyond the local region. She was a trauma surgeon by training, but she had transitioned into healthcare administration and medical technology development in ways that had made her both wealthy and influential in medical circles around the world. "I was in Indiana investigating potential sites for a new trauma center," Catherine explained. "Rural areas like this one are underserved by emergency medical facilities, and patients often die simply because they can't reach appropriate care quickly enough. Your helicopter transport yesterday was exactly the kind of capability that we're trying to provide on a permanent basis." The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. Marcus had risked his family's financial future to provide emergency transport for someone who was working to solve the same kinds of problems that had made his helicopter flight necessary. Catherine Morgan was trying to bring better emergency medical care into rural areas, and Marcus had accidentally demonstrated exactly why such services were needed. "The nearest trauma center is 90 miles away," Marcus observed. "Yesterday's accident could happen to anyone who lives around here, and most people wouldn't be as lucky as you were." Catherine nodded thoughtfully, her expression suggesting that she was processing information in ways that extended beyond their immediate conversation. "Mr. Whitfield, may I ask what you do when you're not flying emergency rescue missions?" The question opened a door to discussions that Marcus hadn't expected and probably wouldn't have initiated on his own. Over the next hour, he found himself explaining the challenges facing family farms in general and Whitfield Farm in particular. Catherine listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was genuinely interested in understanding both the specific details of his situation and the broader economic pressures that were forcing rural families to abandon generations of family heritage. "So the helicopter that saved my life is actually the most valuable asset you own, but you can't afford to operate it regularly because of the financial pressures on your farming operation," Catherine summarized. "And you're facing foreclosure in less than 3 weeks unless you can raise nearly $100,000. Marcus confirmed her understanding while wondering why he was sharing such personal information with someone he had just met. There was something about Catherine Morgan that invited honesty and made it easy to discuss problems that he normally kept private. Perhaps it was her medical training, or perhaps it was simply the bond that had been created when he had risked everything to save her life. "Mr. Whitfield," Catherine said after a long pause, "I'd like to make you a proposition." The proposition that Catherine Morgan presented to Marcus Whitfield was unlike anything he could have imagined when he'd made the decision to risk his helicopter for a stranger's life. As she spoke, her voice carried the confidence of someone who had built a career on making complex decisions under pressure, and her offer would either solve every problem his family faced or create complications that would change their lives in ways they couldn't predict. "I need a helicopter pilot for my medical operations," Catherine said, adjusting her position in the hospital bed with the careful movements of someone managing significant pain. Not just any pilot, but someone who understands emergency medicine, rural geography, and most importantly, someone who makes decisions based on saving lives rather than protecting assets. Marcus felt a mixture of hope and skepticism that made him cautious about responding too quickly. Job offers that seemed too good to be true usually were, and his recent experience with financial crisis had taught him to examine opportunities carefully before making commitments that could affect his family's future. What kind of medical operations? He asked, settling into the chair beside Catherine's bed and trying to process the implications of what she was suggesting. Catherine's explanation revealed a scope of ambition that extended far beyond anything Marcus had encountered in his experience with rural healthcare. She was the founder and CEO of Morgan Medical Solutions, a company that specialized in bringing advanced trauma care to underserved areas through a combination of mobile surgical units, emergency transport services, and telemedicine technology. We operate in regions where the nearest trauma center might be hours away by conventional transport, Catherine continued. Rural areas, remote industrial sites, disaster zones where traditional emergency services can't provide adequate coverage. Our pilots don't just transport patients, they're integral members of medical teams that bring hospital-level care directly to people who need it. The company operated a fleet of medical helicopters equipped with surgical capabilities that rivaled those found in major hospital emergency departments. Each aircraft was staffed with trauma surgeons, emergency medicine specialists, and support personnel who could perform life-saving procedures during transport or at remote locations where traditional ambulances couldn't reach patients quickly enough. Yesterday's rescue mission wasn't just good flying, Catherine said, her eyes studying Marcus with the kind of analytical attention he'd seen in doctors who were making difficult diagnoses. It was exactly the kind of decision-making we need from our pilots. You assessed a life-threatening situation, calculated the risks, and chose to prioritize human life over financial considerations. That kind of judgment can't be taught. Marcus understood that he was being offered more than just employment. Catherine was describing a career that would utilize his flying skills, his emergency response training, and his instinctive understanding of rural communities in ways that could make a meaningful difference in people's lives. The work would be challenging, dangerous, and rewarding in ways that extended far beyond financial compensation. The position would require extensive training, Catherine continued. Emergency medical procedures, advanced flight operations, crisis management protocols. We'd need you to relocate to our training facility in Colorado for 6 months of intensive preparation. After that, you'd be assigned to one of our regional operations centers. The training program Catherine described was comprehensive and demanding, designed to prepare pilots for situations that combined the technical challenges of emergency aviation with the medical complexities of trauma care. Pilots learned to work as part of surgical teams, to make split-second decisions about patient care during flight, and to operate in conditions that tested both their flying skills and their ability to function under extreme pressure. What about my farm? Marcus asked, because the question was unavoidable even though he suspected he already knew the answer. Catherine's expression became sympathetic but direct. The position would require full-time commitment and extensive travel. It wouldn't be compatible with operating a farming business. The choice she was presenting was stark and immediate. Marcus could continue fighting to save Whitfield Farm, knowing that the odds of success were diminishing with each passing day, or he could accept an opportunity that would provide financial security and meaningful work but would require abandoning the legacy his family had built over 4 generations. I understand this is a difficult decision, Catherine said. Take time to discuss it with your family. But I should mention that the compensation package includes a signing bonus that would be sufficient to resolve your current financial obligations. The signing bonus Catherine mentioned was larger than Marcus had expected, enough to pay off the farm's debts, satisfy the bank's foreclosure demands, and provide a substantial cushion for whatever decision his family made about their future. The offer would eliminate their immediate financial crisis and give them options they didn't currently possess. Why me? Marcus asked, trying to understand why someone with Catherine's resources and connections would offer such an opportunity to a farmer she had met under emergency circumstances. Catherine smiled with the kind of warmth that suggested she had anticipated his question. Because yesterday you proved that you have the 2 qualities we value most in our pilots. You have exceptional flying skills under pressure, and you make decisions based on what's right rather than what's safe. The conversation continued for another hour, with Catherine providing details about Morgan Medical Solutions that revealed the scope and sophistication of the organization she had built. The company operated in 12 countries, maintained a fleet of 30 aircraft, and had saved thousands of lives in situations where conventional emergency services would have been inadequate. "We're not just a medical transport service," Catherine explained. "We're trying to revolutionize emergency care in places where geography, economics, or infrastructure make traditional healthcare delivery impossible. Your helicopter flight yesterday was exactly the kind of intervention we provide on a systematic basis." Marcus learned that Catherine had founded the company after completing her residency in trauma surgery and realizing that many of the patients she couldn't save had died not from their injuries but from the time required to transport them to appropriate medical facilities. Her solution had been to bring the medical facilities to the patients, using advanced aviation technology and mobile surgical equipment to eliminate the delays that cost lives in emergency situations. "I started with 1 helicopter and 2 physicians," Catherine said. "Now we have operations centers on 4 continents and we're expanding rapidly. The work is challenging, but it's also incredibly rewarding when you know that your skills are directly responsible for saving lives that would otherwise be lost." The financial details of the offer were compelling in ways that Marcus tried not to find overwhelming. The base salary was more than 3 times what he had ever earned from farming, even during the most successful years. The benefits package included health insurance, retirement contributions, and educational opportunities that would provide security for his family regardless of what happened to agricultural markets or weather patterns. Most significantly, the signing bonus would not only resolve their immediate debt crisis but would provide enough capital to either maintain the farm as a rental property or sell it under favorable conditions rather than through foreclosure proceedings. The offer represented financial freedom in ways that Marcus had never imagined possible, but accepting Catherine's proposition would also mean acknowledging that his dream of continuing his family's farming legacy was over. The Whitfield family had been farmers for 4 generations, and Marcus would be the first to abandon agriculture for a completely different career. The decision would affect not just his own life, but the meaning and continuity of everything his ancestors had built. That evening, Marcus drove home from the hospital with his mind spinning through calculations and possibilities that seemed to change every time he examined them from a different angle. The offer from Catherine Morgan was generous beyond anything he had hoped for, but it also represented a fundamental change in direction that would affect every aspect of his family's future. Sarah was waiting in the kitchen when he arrived, having spent the afternoon researching Morgan Medical Solutions and trying to understand what kind of organization her husband might be joining. Her laptop was open to the company's website, which featured photographs of sleek medical helicopters, sophisticated surgical equipment, and testimonials from patients whose lives had been saved through the company's interventions. "This is a real company," Sarah said, showing him articles from medical journals and business publications that detailed Catherine Morgan's reputation and the success of her organization. "She's not just wealthy, she's famous in medical circles." Forbes magazine called her one of the most innovative healthcare entrepreneurs in the world. The research Sarah had conducted revealed that Catherine Morgan was indeed a legitimate businesswoman whose company had earned recognition for its contributions to emergency medicine and humanitarian relief efforts. Morgan Medical Solutions had been involved in disaster response operations around the world, providing medical care in situations where traditional healthcare infrastructure had been damaged or destroyed. "The job offer is real too," Marcus said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table and trying to process the magnitude of the opportunity he had been presented. 6 months of training in Colorado, then assignment to a regional operations center. "The pay is more than we've ever made from farming." Emma had been put to bed hours earlier, but Marcus could hear her moving around in her crib through the baby monitor that sat on the kitchen counter. The sound of his daughter's nighttime restlessness reminded him that the decisions he and Sarah made in the next few days would shape Emma's childhood and determine what kind of life she would have growing up. "What about the farm?" Sarah asked, because she understood that the question was central to everything else they needed to consider. Marcus explained the financial details of Catherine's offer, including the signing bonus that would eliminate their debt and provide options for the farm's future that didn't currently exist. They could pay off the mortgage, satisfy their creditors, and either maintain the property as an investment or sell it at market value rather than through foreclosure proceedings. "So we could keep the farm but not work it ourselves," Sarah said, trying to understand the practical implications of accepting Catherine's offer. "We could lease the land to another farmer, or we could sell it to someone who would continue the agricultural operation," Marcus replied. "Either way, the farm would survive even if our family wasn't directly involved in running it." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had ever had as a married couple. They were discussing not just a job change or a geographic relocation, but a fundamental transformation in their family's identity and relationship to the land that had shaped 4 generations of Whitfields. Sarah had grown up in town and had married into farming rather than inheriting it as a family tradition. Her perspective on the farm was practical and emotional, but not bound by the same sense of generational obligation that sometimes made it difficult for Marcus to see their situation clearly. "Marcus," she said finally, reaching across the table to take his hand, "your great-grandfather would want you to make the decision that's best for Emma and for our family's future. He wouldn't want you to sacrifice your daughter's opportunities to preserve something that might not survive anyway." The wisdom in Sarah's observation was undeniable, but it was also painful in ways that Marcus struggled to articulate. Accepting Catherine's offer would mean admitting that the farm couldn't be saved through determination and hard work alone, that some problems were too large for individual solutions, and that his ancestors' legacy might be better honored by choosing a different path than by trying to continue theirs. Over the next 3 days, Marcus found himself torn between excitement about the opportunities Catherine's offer represented and grief about the loss of everything he had planned for his family's future. The work with Morgan Medical Solutions would be meaningful and well compensated, but it would also require leaving behind the only life he had ever known and the only work he had ever imagined himself doing. The decision became more complicated when Catherine called to provide additional details about the position and to answer questions that Marcus and Sarah had developed during their discussions. The conversation revealed that Catherine's interest in Marcus extended beyond his piloting skills to include his understanding of rural communities and agricultural economics. "One of our expansion priorities is developing emergency medical services for rural," Catherine explained during their phone conversation. "Farm accidents, equipment injuries, remote location emergencies where conventional ambulance services can't provide adequate response times. Your background gives you insights that most of our pilots don't possess." The specialization Catherine was describing would allow Marcus to use both his aviation skills and his agricultural knowledge in ways that could directly benefit farming communities like the one he was considering leaving. The irony wasn't lost on him that accepting her offer might allow him to help other farmers deal with the kinds of emergencies that were common in agricultural operations. "We're also exploring partnerships with agricultural cooperatives and rural hospitals to provide emergency medical coverage for farming regions," Catherine continued. "Someone with your background could be instrumental in developing those programs." The possibility that his new career might eventually bring him back to serve farming communities added another layer of complexity to the decision Marcus faced. He could leave agriculture but potentially return to help agricultural communities in ways that his farming operation never could have achieved. Sarah had been listening to the conversation on speakerphone, and after Catherine hung up, she voiced the question that both of them had been avoiding. "When do we need to decide?" Marcus looked at the calendar on the kitchen wall, counting the days until their next meeting with the bank and the deadline for resolving their foreclosure crisis. "Catherine needs an answer within a week if I'm going to start the training program in time for the next class." The timeline was tight but manageable, giving them enough time to research the opportunity thoroughly and make an informed decision about their family's future. But the deadline also added pressure to a choice that would have been difficult under any circumstances. That weekend, Marcus drove through the farm one final time, examining the fields and buildings that represented 4 generations of family investment and trying to imagine what his great-grandfather would think about the decision he was facing. The drought-stressed corn that would never reach harvest stood as a reminder of the challenges that had made farming increasingly difficult, but the well-maintained buildings and carefully tended pastures also demonstrated the pride and dedication that had characterized his family's relationship to the land. The helicopter sat in its barn, cleaned and serviced after the emergency flight that had changed everything. Marcus ran his hands along the aircraft's fuselage, remembering his father's pride in the machine and his belief that it would secure the farm's future for generations. In an unexpected way, his father's vision had been correct. The helicopter was going to secure his family's future, just not in the way Robert Whitfield had imagined. Sunday morning brought a phone call that added urgency to the decision Marcus was trying to make. Catherine Morgan had been released from the hospital and was flying back to her headquarters in Colorado, but she wanted to make one final stop before leaving Indiana. "I'd like to see your farm," she said when Marcus answered the phone. "I want to understand what you'd be leaving behind before you make your final decision." Catherine arrived at Whitfield Farm in a rental car, having declined Marcus's offer to pick her up at the hospital. She was moving carefully due to her injuries, but her alertness and energy seemed to have returned completely during her recovery. She wore civilian clothes that were practical and expensive, projecting the kind of understated professionalism that characterized successful business people who didn't need to display their wealth obviously. The tour of the farm that Marcus provided was both educational and emotional, giving Catherine insight into the challenges facing agricultural operations while forcing Marcus to articulate what the farm meant to his family's identity and sense of purpose. They walked through the fields where 4 generations of Whitfields had grown crops, raised livestock, and built a life based on working the land and contributing to their community's agricultural economy. "Your great-grandfather chose this location well," Catherine observed, studying the topography and water sources that had made the farm viable for nearly a century. Good soil, adequate water rights, transportation access to market. Under normal circumstances, this operation should be profitable. Marcus explained the combination of factors that had created their current crisis, from weather patterns and international trade disputes to equipment failures and medical expenses that had consumed their financial reserves. Catherine listened with the attention of someone who understood complex systems and could recognize when multiple problems converged to create situations that exceeded anyone's ability to manage them effectively. "You're not failing because of poor management or lack of dedication," Catherine said as they examined the barn where his father's tools and equipment were stored with the care of someone who respected quality machinery. "You're facing a perfect storm of circumstances that would have defeated most farming operations." The observation was both comforting and troubling, confirming that Marcus's struggles weren't the result of personal inadequacy while also suggesting that the problems facing his farm were too large for individual solutions. Catherine's assessment reinforced his growing understanding that accepting her job offer might be the most responsible choice he could make for his family's future. They ended the tour at the helicopter barn, where Catherine examined the Bell 206 with the expertise of someone who understood aviation technology and could recognize quality equipment when she saw it. She asked technical questions about the aircraft's maintenance history, modifications, and operational capabilities that demonstrated her familiarity with helicopter operations. "This is exactly the kind of aircraft we use for our medical operations," Catherine said, running her hand along the helicopter's fuselage with obvious appreciation. "Well maintained, properly equipped, and flown by someone who understands both the machine and the mission." The comment led to a discussion about whether Marcus's helicopter could be integrated into Morgan Medical Solutions' fleet, either through purchase or lease arrangements that would allow the aircraft to continue serving emergency medical purposes while providing additional income for the Whitfield family. "We're always looking for additional aircraft, especially ones that come with pilots who understand their capabilities," Catherine explained. "If you joined our organization, we could arrange for your helicopter to be modified for medical transport and assigned to one of our operation centers." The possibility that his father's helicopter could continue serving the community through Catherine's medical operations added another dimension to the decision Marcus was trying to make. The aircraft could continue saving lives, just in a more systematic and professional manner than the volunteer work Marcus had been doing with the county search and rescue team. Sarah joined them for coffee in the kitchen, giving Catherine an opportunity to see the family context that would be affected by Marcus's decision. Emma was taking her afternoon nap, but the house was filled with evidence of family life that had been built around farming schedules and rural community involvement. "This is a beautiful home," Catherine said, examining the photographs and family memorabilia that documented 4 generations of Whitfield family history. "I can understand why leaving it would be difficult." The conversation that followed was honest and direct, with Catherine acknowledging the magnitude of what she was asking Marcus to consider while also explaining the opportunities that her offer represented for his family's future. She wasn't trying to pressure him into making a quick decision, but she was helping him understand the full implications of the choice he faced. "Whatever you decide, you should know that yesterday's rescue mission proved you have the skills and judgment we need," Catherine said as she prepared to leave. "But more than that, it showed you have the character we value. Our pilots don't just transport patients, they're the people families trust with their most precious possessions during the worst moments of their lives." After Catherine left, Marcus and Sarah spent the evening discussing the information they had gathered and trying to understand what their decision would mean for Emma's future and their own relationship to the community that had been their home for their entire lives. The choice they faced was clear but not easy, requiring them to choose between preserving their family's agricultural legacy and accepting an opportunity that could provide security and meaningful work in a completely different field. "What does your heart tell you?" Sarah asked as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky above their failing corn crop. Marcus considered the question carefully, trying to separate his emotional attachment to the farm from his practical understanding of their situation and the opportunities that Catherine's offer represented. My heart tells me that my great-grandfather would want me to make the decision that gives Emma the best possible future, he said finally. And my head tells me that Catherine's offer is the best opportunity our family is likely to see. The next morning brought a phone call from the bank requesting a meeting to discuss the status of their mortgage and the timeline for resolving their financial obligations. The conversation was professional but firm, making it clear that foreclosure proceedings would begin immediately if they couldn't demonstrate a realistic plan for bringing their account current. "We have 1 week," Marcus told Sarah after hanging up the phone. "Either we accept Catherine's offer and use the signing bonus to pay off the debt, or we lose everything and start over with nothing." The stark nature of their situation eliminated much of the ambiguity that had made their decision difficult. They could choose Catherine's offer and build a new life around meaningful work and financial security, or they could watch their family's legacy disappear through foreclosure proceedings that would leave them homeless and bankrupt. That afternoon, Marcus called Catherine Morgan and accepted her offer to join Morgan Medical Solutions as a helicopter pilot specializing in rural emergency medical services. The conversation was brief and professional, with Catherine expressing satisfaction that he had decided to join her organization and providing details about the next steps in the hiring and training process. "You're making the right decision," Catherine said. "The work won't always be easy, but it will always be important. And I think you'll find that helping other families during their emergencies provides the same kind of satisfaction that farming gave you." The signing bonus arrived by wire transfer 2 days later, eliminating Whitfield Farm's debt and providing enough additional capital to maintain the property while Marcus completed his training and began his new career. The farm would be leased to a neighboring operation that specialized in organic vegetables, ensuring that the land would continue to be farmed while generating income that would help support the family during their transition. As Marcus prepared to leave for Colorado in 6 months of intensive training, he stood once more in the helicopter barn where his father had taught him to fly and where he had made the decision to risk everything for a stranger's life. The Bell 206 would be modified for medical transport and eventually assigned to Morgan Medical Solutions Midwest Operations Center, allowing it to continue serving rural communities in ways that Robert Whitfield would have understood and supported. The decision to leave farming hadn't been easy, but it had been right. Marcus was trading one form of service to his community for another, exchanging the seasonal rhythms of agriculture for the constant urgency of emergency medicine. His family's legacy would continue in new forms, shaped by the same values of hard work, community service, and commitment to helping others that had characterized 4 generations of Whitfields who had built their lives around the land. Emma would grow up in a different world than her father had imagined, but it would be a world where her family had financial security and her father did work that saved lives and made a measurable difference in the world. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage involved letting go of what you loved in order to embrace what you were meant to become. 5 years after Marcus Whitfield made the decision that transformed his family's destiny, he stood on the landing pad of the Marcus Whitfield Rural Emergency Medical Center, watching the morning sun illuminate the state-of-the-art facility that bore his name and represented everything he had learned about courage, sacrifice, and the unexpected ways that life rewards those who choose service over safety. The medical center had been built on land donated by grateful families whose lives had been touched by Morgan Medical Solutions' rural emergency response programs. It served a region covering 3 states, providing helicopter-based trauma care to farming communities, remote industrial sites, and small towns where the nearest hospital might be hours away by conventional transport. Marcus had just completed his 1,000th emergency flight as chief pilot for Morgan Medical Solutions Midwest Division, a milestone that represented not just professional achievement but also the evolution of his understanding of what it meant to carry on his family's legacy of service to rural communities. Each flight had taught him something new about emergency medicine, crisis management, and the profound responsibility that came with holding other people's lives in his hands. The Bell 206 that had started this journey sat in the center hangar, now equipped with advanced life support systems, surgical equipment, and communications technology that allowed the aircraft to function as a flying emergency room. The helicopter bore the distinctive red and white markings of Morgan Medical Solutions, but Marcus had been allowed to add a small notation on the fuselage that read Whitfield Farm Memorial Flight, honoring his father's vision and the agricultural heritage that had shaped his character. Dr. Catherine Morgan emerged from the medical center's administrative offices, walking with the confident stride of someone whose vision had transformed emergency medical care across multiple continents. In the 5 years since their first meeting in a hospital room, Catherine had expanded Morgan Medical Solutions into one of the world's leading providers of emergency medical transport, with operations centers on 6 continents and a fleet of over 200 aircraft. "Ready for the dedication ceremony?" Catherine asked, joining Marcus beside the helicopter that had brought them together under circumstances neither could have predicted. The dedication ceremony was the culmination of years of planning and development that had grown from Marcus's insights about the specific medical needs of rural communities. His understanding of agricultural operations, remote location challenges, and the tight-knit nature of farming families had helped Catherine's organization develop specialized protocols for rural emergency response that were being adopted by medical systems around the world. "I keep thinking about what my father would say if he could see this," Marcus replied, gesturing toward the medical center that had been built to serve the same communities where Robert Whitfield had flown crop dusting missions and provided aerial support for local farmers. "He always believed the helicopter would help rural communities, but I don't think he imagined anything like this." The medical center represented more than just advanced technology and emergency response capabilities. It was the physical manifestation of a philosophy that Marcus had developed during his years with Morgan Medical Solutions, the understanding that the most sophisticated medical equipment in the world was meaningless without the human judgment, dedication, and courage required to use it effectively in life or death situations. Emma Whitfield, now 6 years old and attending the local elementary school, ran across the landing pad with the fearless enthusiasm of a child who had grown up around helicopters and medical emergencies. She wore a miniature flight suit that Catherine had commissioned for her, complete with patches from various Morgan Medical Solutions operations centers and a name tag that identified her as future pilot Emma Whitfield. "Daddy, when can I learn to fly the helicopter?" Emma asked, climbing into the pilot's seat of the Bell 206 with the practiced ease of someone who had been exploring aircraft cockpits since she could walk. Marcus helped her adjust the seat and showed her the instruments, explaining their functions with the same patience his father had used when teaching him about aviation. Emma's questions were intelligent and detailed, suggesting that she had inherited both the Whitfield family's mechanical aptitude and their instinctive understanding of how aircraft and emergency response systems functioned. "When you're old enough to reach the pedals properly," Marcus replied, which was the same answer his father had given him decades earlier. "But first you need to learn about medicine and helping people, because flying is just the tool we use to do the important work." Sarah appeared in the medical center's doorway, wearing the professional attire of someone who had found her own meaningful career within Catherine's organization. She had completed training as an emergency medical dispatcher and now coordinated rescue operations from the center's communications facility, using her detailed knowledge of local geography and farming operations to guide helicopter crews to remote accident sites. The Whitfield family had discovered that leaving farming didn't mean abandoning their connection to rural communities. Instead, it had allowed them to serve those communities in ways that were more immediate and directly life-saving than anything they could have accomplished through agricultural production. Marcus's flights regularly took him to farms throughout the region, often to assist with the kinds of accidents and medical emergencies that were common in agricultural operations. "The governor's helicopter just landed," Sarah announced, indicating that the dedication ceremony was about to begin. "He's brought state emergency management officials and representatives from 3 universities that want to study our rural response protocols." The attention that the medical center had attracted from government officials and academic researchers reflected the innovative nature of the programs Marcus had helped develop. His insights about rural community needs and agricultural operations had led to the creation of specialized emergency response protocols that were being studied and implemented by emergency medical services across the country. Catherine had invited Marcus to present the keynote address for the dedication ceremony, asking him to explain how his background in farming had informed his approach to emergency medical aviation. The speech he had prepared focused on the similarities between agricultural work and emergency medical response, both of which required patience, dedication, attention to detail, and the willingness to make critical decisions under pressure. "Farming taught me that the most important work is often the work that nobody sees," Marcus planned to tell the assembled crowd of medical professionals, government officials, and community leaders. Preparing soil, maintaining equipment, monitoring weather patterns, making countless small decisions that determine whether crops succeed or fail. Emergency medical response requires the same kind of careful preparation and constant vigilance. The dedication ceremony itself was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the medical center's operations. Farmers who had been airlifted to trauma centers after equipment accidents, families whose children had received life-saving care during medical emergencies, and emergency responders who had worked with Marcus and his team during crisis situations. Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, the trauma surgeon who had called Marcus on the night after Catherine's rescue, served as the master of ceremonies for the dedication. She had become a close friend and colleague during the years since that first emergency transport, and she had been instrumental in developing the medical protocols that made the center's operations possible. 5 years ago, a farmer named Marcus Whitfield made a decision that probably seemed crazy to everyone who knew him. Dr. Harrison told the assembled crowd. He risked his family's most valuable possession to help a stranger, not knowing that the stranger was someone who would transform his life and the lives of countless other people in rural communities across the region. The story of Marcus's emergency flight and its consequences had become something of a legend within emergency medical circles, used as an example of how individual acts of courage could have far-reaching consequences that extended beyond the immediate situation. Catherine often told the story during speaking engagements, describing it as the moment when she understood that the most advanced medical technology was meaningless without people who possessed the character and judgment to use it effectively. But the real story isn't about helicopters or medical equipment, Dr. Harrison continued. It's about what happens when people choose to help others, even when they can't afford the cost, and it's about how those choices create opportunities that benefit entire communities. Marcus's speech focused on the lessons he had learned during his transition from farming to emergency medical aviation, emphasizing the similarities between the two professions and the ways that his agricultural background had prepared him for the challenges of rural emergency response. He spoke about the importance of understanding local communities, the value of practical experience over theoretical knowledge, and the satisfaction that came from work that made a measurable difference in people's lives. Farming taught me that the most rewarding work is the work that serves others, Marcus told the audience. Growing food that feeds families, caring for land that will support future generations, contributing to communities that depend on agriculture for their economic foundation. Emergency medical aviation serves the same fundamental purpose, just in a different way. The audience included many of the farmers and rural families who had been helped by the medical center's operations, and their presence reminded Marcus of why he had chosen to accept Catherine's offer despite the difficulty of leaving his family's agricultural legacy. The work he was doing now served the same communities his ancestors had served, just through medical care rather than food production. After the ceremony, Marcus found himself in the medical center's conference room with Catherine, Sarah, and several of the other pilots and medical professionals who had helped build the rural emergency response program. They were reviewing expansion plans that would extend similar services to agricultural regions in other states, creating a network of rural medical centers that could provide comprehensive emergency care to farming communities across the Midwest. The success of this center has convinced our board to approve funding for 6 additional rural operations centers, Catherine announced, revealing plans that would significantly expand Morgan Medical Solutions' commitment to agricultural emergency medicine. We want Marcus to oversee the development of all 6 centers, using the protocols and training programs he's developed here as the model for rural emergency response. The promotion Catherine was offering would make Marcus the Director of Rural Operations for Morgan Medical Solutions North American Division, with responsibility for emergency medical services across agricultural regions in 12 states. The position would require extensive travel and administrative responsibilities, but it would also allow him to shape emergency medical care for rural communities on a scale that could affect millions of people. I've learned that the best opportunities usually come disguised as impossible choices, Marcus replied, thinking about the decision he had faced 5 years earlier when Catherine had first offered him a position with her organization. Sometimes you have to risk everything you have to discover what you're really capable of becoming. Emma had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense attention of a child who understood that important decisions were being made. She looked up from the coloring book she had been working on and asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. Daddy, does this mean we're going to help even more people? Marcus picked up his daughter and settled her on his lap, looking around the conference room at the people who had become his colleagues and friends in the work of saving lives and serving rural communities. Emma's question reminded him that the most important measure of any decision was whether it increased his family's ability to help others and contribute to something larger than their own interests. "Yes, sweetheart," Marcus replied, "it means we're going to help a lot more people." The meeting continued with discussions of budgets, timelines and operational details that would determine how quickly the new rural medical centers could be established and begin serving their communities. Marcus contributed insights based on his experience with the Whitfield Center, explaining the importance of understanding local ethics. As the sun set over the medical center that bore his name, Marcus stood once again on the landing pad where his helicopter waited for the next emergency call. The aircraft was fueled, equipped, and ready to respond to whatever crisis might require his skills during the night ahead. The same Bell 206 that had saved Catherine Morgan's life now served as the flagship of a rural emergency response program that had saved hundreds of lives and was being replicated across the country. Sarah joined him on the landing pad, carrying Emma, who had fallen asleep during the drive home from the dedication ceremony. The little girl was still wearing her miniature flight suit, and her peaceful expression suggested dreams filled with helicopters and the important work of helping people during emergencies. "Do you ever regret leaving the farm?" Sarah asked, a question she posed occasionally when quiet moments allowed them to reflect on the path their lives had taken. Marcus considered the question as he had many times before, thinking about the cornfields that were now being farmed by their neighbors, the farmhouse that they visited regularly but no longer called home, and the agricultural legacy that had been transformed rather than abandoned. "I regret that Emma won't grow up on the farm," Marcus replied honestly. "But I don't regret the choice we made. We're still serving rural communities, still helping our neighbors, still doing work that matters. We're just doing it in a different way than our ancestors did." The radio in his flight suit crackled with an emergency call from the dispatch center, reporting a serious farm accident 30 miles north of their location. Marcus kissed Sarah and Emma goodbye, performed his pre-flight inspection with practiced efficiency, and lifted off into the darkness to respond to another family's crisis. As the helicopter climbed toward its cruising altitude, Marcus reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him from near bankruptcy to meaningful work that saved lives and served communities across multiple states. The decision to risk his helicopter for a stranger's emergency had seemed like financial madness at the time, but it had led to opportunities and rewards that extended far beyond anything he could have achieved by playing it safe. The lights of the medical center grew smaller behind him as he flew toward another emergency, another family in crisis, another opportunity to prove that some risks are worth taking when they're taken for the right reasons. Marcus Whitfield had learned that the most important inheritance parents can leave their children isn't money or property, but the example of choosing service over safety, courage over comfort, and the willingness to risk everything for the chance to help others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.